Canada supplies America with more oil than any country on Earth, including Saudi Arabia. It holds the minerals that power every electric vehicle and clean energy grid on the planet. And somehow, Washington looked at all of that and decided Canada had no leverage. That mistake is now costing them. Welcome to Canada Economy, where we break down the real forces shaping Canada's financial future, its global trade position, and what it all means for the people who actually live here. If you're not subscribed yet, do it right now, because this is exactly the kind of breakdown that matters before everyone else is talking about it. Here is the economic reality that almost never gets stated clearly. Canada is the 9th largest economy in the world. It supplies the United States with more oil than Saudi Arabia, more than any OPEC nation on Earth. It holds some of the largest reserves of critical minerals that every major government is right now racing to secure. It feeds hundreds of millions of people across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. It sits on geography that controls energy corridors, water systems, and Arctic trade routes that no other country can access the same way. That is not a position of weakness. That is one of the most powerful economic positions on the planet. And for 30 years, Canada held that position while consistently accepting less than it was worth. The reason this happened is structural, not accidental. When NAFTA came into force in the early 1990s, Canadian businesses reorganized themselves entirely around American market access. Supply chains crossed the border in both directions, sometimes 4 or 5 times before a single product was finished. The auto sector, the energy sector, agriculture, lumber, steel, all of it became so entangled with the American economy that the idea of building serious alternatives stopped feeling necessary. And the deeper that entanglement went, the more Canada's economic and political leadership began treating the relationship not as something Canada had power within, but as something Canada had to carefully manage. That mental shift, from power to management, is what gradually eroded Canada's negotiating position over 3 decades. Because when you are managing a relationship instead of exercising leverage within it, you make fundamentally different decisions. You absorb pressure instead of deflecting it. You accept terms instead of setting them. You stay quiet instead of making clear what leaving the table would actually cost the other side. Canada absorbed pressure for years. It took tariff hits on softwood lumber and called it a known cost of doing business. It accepted renegotiation processes built around American political timelines and called it cooperation. It watched its share of North American economic decision-making shrink gradually and called it pragmatism. Washington read all of that clearly. Washington drew a conclusion that shaped everything that followed, that Canada had no real alternatives, that it was fully dependent on the American relationship, and that it would accept whatever terms were placed in front of it because it had nowhere else to go. That conclusion, built from 30 years of observing Canadian behavior, turned out to be the costliest miscalculation Washington made in this entire situation. When Donald Trump returned to the White House, the full weight of that miscalculation became visible. The tariff threats came back immediately, and they were direct. The public language shifted from partnership to pressure within weeks. Canada was described as a country exploiting the United States, as a trade liability rather than a trade asset. And then came the 51st state comment, which landed in Canada not just as an insult, but as a clear statement of how Washington had come to understand the relationship, not as 2 sovereign economies with mutual dependencies and mutual leverage, but as one dominant economy and one dependent territory, where the dominant party dictates terms and the dependent party accepts them. That framing, more than any specific tariff number or trade dispute, was the economic threat that demanded a response. Because once a country accepts that framing, once it lets that perception solidify in the minds of its trading partners, it loses negotiating ground on everything permanently. What made the situation more serious was what was happening away from the public pressure. While the tariff rhetoric was running in public, American and Mexican negotiators were running a separate, coordinated process in private. They were aligning positions, building consensus, and establishing the architecture of future North American trade arrangements, consistently without Canada in the room. Canada was then being presented with those finished positions and asked to agree. Not invited to participate, not consulted at the foundational level, presented with outcomes and asked for a signature. In economic and diplomatic terms, that is an enormous distinction. Countries that shape frameworks have power. Countries that are handed frameworks and asked to ratify them have almost none. Canada was being moved into the second category, and the process was moving fast. Now here is the part of this that cuts through everything else, because this is what changes the entire picture. The assumption driving all of that pressure, the assumption behind the exclusion and the 51st state rhetoric and the bilateral frameworks built without Canadian input, was that Canada had no real economic alternatives, that it was so deeply integrated with and dependent on the American market, that it would absorb whatever it was handed. That assumption is not just wrong, it is the opposite of the underlying economic reality. Canada holds the critical mineral reserves that the entire global clean energy economy depends on to function. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, rare earth elements, every electric vehicle battery, every grid-scale energy storage system, every industrial-scale solar and wind installation anywhere in the world requires these materials. The countries that hold large, accessible, politically stable deposits of these resources have extraordinary leverage in the economic order being built right now. Canada is one of those countries. More specifically, Canada is the most attractive source of these materials for Western economies because it combines massive reserves with stable governance, established mining and processing infrastructure, and existing trade frameworks that make reliable delivery at scale actually achievable. Other countries have critical minerals, but most of them come with political instability, governance deficits, or infrastructure gaps that make long-term supply agreements genuinely risky. Canada has none of those problems. In the current global competition to lock in clean energy supply chains, Canada is close to irreplaceable for any economy that is serious about the transition. The energy picture adds another layer of hard leverage that gets consistently underplayed. Canada is the single largest foreign supplier of oil to the United States. Not the second largest, not a significant supplier, the largest. It delivers more crude oil to American refineries than Saudi Arabia, than Russia, than any OPEC member. It supplies massive amounts of electricity directly into American grids through interconnections that power cities and industrial facilities across the northeastern United States right now, today. It has natural gas reserves, nuclear technology, and enormous undeveloped capacity in hydroelectric, wind, and clean power generation that will matter more as global electricity demand grows significantly over the next 2 decades. Europe discovered at catastrophic economic cost what it means to be strategically dependent on an energy supplier that becomes politically unreliable. Every serious government in Europe is now actively trying to diversify towards suppliers that are stable, democratic, and large in scale. Canada fits that requirement precisely and completely. The proposition that Canada is somehow the weaker party in any negotiation involving energy supply is not a matter of opinion. It contradicts the measurable facts. Agriculture is the third pillar of Canada's structural economic leverage, and it rarely gets the weight it deserves in these discussions. Canada is one of the world's most consequential agricultural exporters. Canadian wheat is a primary food source for populations across the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. Canadian canola oil is consumed globally at enormous scale. Canadian pulses provide a critical and often irreplaceable protein source for hundreds of millions of people. As climate disruption continues putting pressure on historically reliable growing regions, the productivity and stability of Canadian farmland is becoming more strategically valuable every year. Food security has moved from being a humanitarian concern to a hard national security priority. Canada is positioned near the top of every serious assessment of which nations others need stable relationships with. The combined weight of those three realities means the assumption of Canadian economic weakness is not just incorrect, it is economically illiterate. Canada holds genuine, structural, durable leverage. The question was never whether Canada had that leverage. The question was whether Canada had the clarity and political will to deploy it. And that answer is what shifted everything. Rather than accepting exclusion, Canada moved in 2 directions at once. It asserted itself in North America, and it accelerated globally. Europe engagement surged, Indo-Pacific ties deepened, and suddenly, Canada had options. Those options changed everything. Because the moment alternatives become real, leverage becomes real, and that is when negotiations shift. The risks remain. Integration with the US is still deep, and shifting takes time. But the direction is clear. The world is reorganizing, and Canada is no longer sitting passively inside it. It is moving, and that movement will define its future. Canada's domestic economic pressures, housing affordability, cost of living, productivity, fiscal capacity, are not patient. They are present, and they are compounding. Managing all of that simultaneously, maintaining a credible external posture while addressing genuine internal economic strain, is the actual governing challenge Canada faces right now. It is harder and more complex than any single policy announcement or diplomatic signal captures. What none of those risks changes is the fundamental shift in Canada's economic position that is now underway. The global economic order is reorganizing faster and more completely than at any point in the past 30 years. The frameworks that govern trade, energy, supply chains, and geopolitical alignment since the early 1990s are being broken by forces that are not temporary and will not reverse. The strategic competition between the United States and China is forcing every government on Earth to make choices about technology access, supply chain security, and political alignment that were genuinely optional a decade ago and are now mandatory. The energy transition is redrawing the map of global economic power. The pandemic proved that the assumption of globally integrated, frictionless supply chains was not a permanent feature of the modern economy. On the map being drawn by those forces, Canada's position is objectively and measurably strong. It holds the critical resources. It has the governance and institutional stability. It has geographic access and established relationships across multiple continents. Countries that hold these structural advantages and deploy them with deliberate, sustained strategy are the countries that will shape the terms of the economic order being built right now. Countries that hold these advantages but fail to deploy them will find themselves structurally disadvantaged. The economic decisions being made in Ottawa right now are not abstract foreign policy exercises. They connect directly to what happens in Canadian households over the next 10 and 20 years. They determine which sectors attract long-term investment. They determine whether Canada's critical mineral wealth generates value domestically or is exported raw. They connect to housing affordability and real wages. They connect to fiscal capacity for healthcare, education, and infrastructure. A country that uses its economic leverage well generates room to solve domestic challenges. A country that undersells its position negotiates from weakness. Canada's economic position in the world is changing. The change is real, measurable, and consequential. The direction of that change is visible and durable. The full consequences will take years to materialize, but the shift is already underway. And understanding it early is an advantage. If you want to stay ahead of what is actually happening to Canada's economy, stay with Canada Economy. Subscribe if you have not already, and we will see you in the next one.